So let me get this all recording and we're set to go. So those of you that are just on the recording, welcome. We're going to enter our leadership discussion panel at this time. So Susan, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to work our way down the list, especially now as we're moving into, getting already hopefully focusing into next year. My first question is going to be is where do you see the benefits of PBL for students beyond academics? And why and how would you share this with staff and the need for PBL? And the reason I ask that, one, it's in the list, but in the schools we work with, they're battling that, like, why do I need to do PBL with kids?
Right. No, I think that's such an important question. And so for us, it's really the skills that we see students leave with outside of their academic context or the things that I really point other school leaders and teachers to really show the success of the model that we use. So we see kids leaving and heading off to college who are really confident presenters, speakers, communicators, kids who have really strong skills collaborating, not only with each other at school, but in the work environments that they're in the college classes that they've taken. And we just see also really strong level of agency among our students, especially like as they enter their junior, senior years, right? And we've help them develop that skill. They really are able to take ownership for their own learning, to take ownership for what they're doing, and to operate with a growth mindset and really grow from their setbacks, not see any of their skills and abilities ever as fixed, but as things that they can, grow and expand upon. And so I think, the best, most impactful way, of course, to observe that is to see students in action and to hear what they have to say about it. I find that when, we have these, it's great for me to have a theoretical conversation with people about it, or for you to attend a training and hear theoretically, what it looks like and what it could be like. But I think the most impactful thing is when you're in a classroom with students who are experiencing learning and developing the skills that we teach in our program, and seeing how they, kind of like how they come in as freshmen, how they progress to seniors, is really, I think, what speaks to the work that we do the best.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things, and what I miss the most of having people not being able to be on campus, right, is really highlighting our students. And I think it was last week, time's either going by too fast or too slow, when we had our student panel. Is really, our students are the stars of the show, right? It's having, when they can have random adults from all over the world come into the classroom and just start talking to them, and kids are able to share about what they're learning. That's really speaks to the powerful. It's more than just the product that they're creating, right? It's about their learning and how they're going through it.
Exactly. And I think sometimes that it's a challenge because that's really hard to measure. Like, it's not something that you can measure in a standardized test or in an assessment. And not that those aren't important measures of kids as well, but it's really something that's a little bit less tangible. But I think sometimes often more valuable is what we hear from kids when we keep track of them after they've graduated and they send us feedback.
Yeah, I think, as I reflect back to my time in the classroom when I was teaching in elementary school, one of the best compliments I ever got, and was always when I would run into the teachers who had my students afterwards, and they'd always say, it's like, I always know when I have your kids. And I'm like, well, why is that? They're like, because they're different, right? They have the skill sets, and they can kind of take that minute to pause about, wow, here's what I'm doing. And it's like, that's what gets us excited as educators, to kind of create these cultures. It's fun to teach in. It's hard, right? But it's fun to teach in. Okay, so now we're going to get into some more logistical type of questions. This is why I think probably a lot of people are here as well. So can you talk a little bit about the model we have for collaboration between teachers, and how is this organized, and how do you find time for co-planning? And I know it'd be really easy to stick into like, well, what's it like now, right? As we're all like buried in COVID stuff, but let's talk about like maybe before, as people are already planning moving forward into next year.
Yeah, and I think I can talk about it too a little bit, and how the principles that we use to guide that, because it looks a little bit different before what we're planning for. But I think for us, it's really making sure that we have a structure within the school day, within contract teacher work time, for them to be able to collaborate and co-plan together. So for us, we've relied upon common prep periods and PLC groupings in the past to allow teachers to do that. So if there's if a teacher is partnered up, and we've had to shift away, not just because of COVID, but we've shifted away from co-teaching just a little bit. We're still integrating our curriculum, but in a different way. So it's part of the strategic mapping of our master schedule, really, is making sure first, right, that we use that structure to serve kids, but that we also provide for some collaborative time for teachers. So that becomes a priority as I'm, right now building my master schedule. I know I have teams of teachers who are integrating. And so a priority in that schedule is making sure that they have common prep time together. We also, I think an important structure is just to have some routines, some plans, some sort of, long-term, year-long learning focus for the adults on our campus. So we'll have, we do some pretty quick cycles of inquiry in our PLCs that are often around a shared school-wide question or some issues that may have emerged staff-wide that we'd like to tackle, so that we can turn around and serve kids the best we can. But that's really just, I think we've something that's intentional and that really responds to the needs of the year are the structures that I have found to be most successful. So whether that's departments like content alike teams, sometimes some years, we see a need for kind of cross-pollinating departments, and we'll form teams that way. But just really placing a priority on that because we value it so much, and carving out time in our schedule is the structure that I really depend upon.
So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the integration. And I know this list that's not a question on our list, but it's a question we get a lot, right? So when we do have people on campus, one of the reasons potentially they come is not only to learn about PBL, but is to see co-teaching on campus, right? So we have bigger some of our classrooms are bigger, where there's 2 teachers, double the students. Not all classrooms are like that. But obviously with this year, that shifted that, right? And so we have now 1 teacher, and we're more mirroring what for really lack of a better term, a traditional comprehensive high school would look like, 1 teacher or classroom, but yet we have teachers integrating a project. What does that look like in terms of maybe a project structure for like, if I'm teaching and you're teaching, but we're doing the same integrated project, but different, what does that look like currently?
Yeah. So I think the only thing that's different is the physical space. The rest of the projects it has remained the same, right? The teachers are planning together. They're, they're identifying a culminating event. They're backwards mapping together. They're identifying the essential standards from each of their content areas. They're scaffolding it out for the kids. It's just that rather than being all in the room at the same time with that, which is a great dynamic to have for kids, the space is just separate. So that's the only difference. And of course, our teachers that are doing this are skilled practitioners at co-teaching, right? They're people that have years of experience co-teaching. So the move to just integrating wasn't too tough for them, but that's really been the only difference. The rest of the planning, the rest of the implementation with the kids, the rest of the kids, understanding the connections, it's almost had to be more explicit for them, right? Like the connections between the subject areas, the opportunities for them to kind of transfer and cross over what they're learning. We've almost had to become more clear about it, more explicit about it because the space is separate. But otherwise, the projects have looked very, very similar.
Okay.
COVID school sign.
Yeah, right. So I'm kind of go back to the collaboration because there was a follow-up question on that. So with the teachers and they're finding time with co-planning, and then as you're in building master schedule now, which is a lot of leaders probably are doing the same joy of life. I know you guys get super excited about this. But what are there some maybe ways of finding efficiencies that streamline that for you so you can kind of, in that process, like, is there little tricks that you use in building that out for that integration?
Yeah, I mean, my trick is, and I don't know that this, translates to every context, but my trick is like, I build the schedule that I want first. Like, okay, I don't know where else to start, right? Like, okay, this is my ideal. Like, these are the priorities that I have. Obviously the kids, I sort through and make sure that all my course requests are correct and that I know how many, and I would imagine this is a workflow for many people, like how many sections I need of each course to make sure that my schedule matches the needs and demands of the students, right? That's the first thing I do. And then I build out like the flow, like, okay, well, I'm going to just make this, the ideal schedule. Like this year, I really want my 3 math teachers plus one of my science teachers who teaches a little bit of math. I want them to have a common prep next year so that we can do some really strong collaboration and vertical articulation in math, right? So I just started by building that in because that's like the top. If I can't get anything else, I'm going to have that. And then I kind of went from there, knowing people that I know they integrate, see if I can get them the same prep, see if I can team people. And then I just see how far I can push it before it no longer works for kids. And then at the point when it doesn't work for kids, then I kind of, I have my priorities mapped out and I'm kind of able to peel the layers back that way. But that seems to work really well for me in terms of, because you can't have it all. You can't have everything in your master schedule. So I start by, knowing what the kids need, what they want, prioritizing, my adult collaborative needs, and then like going crazy and, building like what I think would be the ideal, knowing that I'm going to have to like dial it down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to work for me. That process works really well.
Okay. So this is going to go more to like kind of a holistic approach. I know you're not as hands-on with like project design, but from your leadership lens, I can kind of blend some of these questions together here. Do our teachers build all of their projects, or are they just like pulling them off a shelf? No.
Well, so do you mean, do they build them new every year, or do they build them at some point from scratch?
Yes and yes. Because
So
we know that some of them get repeated in certain variations of them.
I would say it's a little of both. Honestly, I think that there are a lot of our teachers who build projects from the ground up themselves, either based on an interest that they have or an event that's happening in the community or a desire that they hear from students. And then I think that there's some times where, there are some really good quality project examples out there. Particularly with a teacher who may be new to implementing PBL in their classroom, if there's something that's really tried and true. I think at our side, it's often not projects that they're pulling from an outside source, but maybe that they're sharing with one another, right? Like at some point it was created on our campus and, it's kind of had different iterations and now so-and-so's teaching it in physics or whatever. So I think that there's some sharing in that regard, but, I think it really just depends. We try, you have to have that balance, right? Between wanting to keep everything really fresh and new and cutting edge and as authentic each year as possible. And then like the reality of planning burnout. So I think there's a real healthy balance that can be struck there.
Do we have a school-wide exhibition night? I know in some schools that's kind of a big deal. Like, hey, there's one night where we have an exhibition night. Do we have that?
I would say the one school-wide thing we do is we have an exhibition night. I don't know if it's an exhibition night, but like a night where seniors are able to showcase their portfolios. And prior to COVID school, we were piloting like a defensive learning night with our freshman team. But our culminating events tend to be more authentically related to the particular project that the student is completing. So, those events take place when it's natural for them to take place at the conclusion of a project, and it doesn't always like perfectly line up. And I know that works well in some settings, but for us, it has been very difficult to coordinate. And sometimes it feels a little bit contrived when we try to force those kinds of events. So instead we will have events when we need to have events. So our freshman team, for example, we have all teachers, there's sometimes events that'll culminate in like an evening performance that the kids put on or a panel that they host or some sort of event. And we just invite community members and parents onto campus at that time and celebrate that particular project conclusion.
Okay. So easy one. So now let's, and you mentioned new, you said the word new. So my head went straight to, I see the question, new teachers, teacher turnover. How do you do it? So, we don't have a massive staff, but yet we still have turnover just because of community and everything else. So how do you bring new teachers up to speed? How do you support teachers who might not know a lot about PBL? What is your method there?
Yeah, so I think, it's something, and this is not the first school that I've been at that's project-based, right? So I was at a very large comprehensive high school that was project-based and, then made my way to New Tech. And so I think that the struggle that I've observed for a number of years now is really that onboarding process, or even, interviewing someone in such a way that you kind of understand, like, is this going to be the teacher going to be the right fit for this type of environment? And I think this is my like theory, my theory of action at this point, right? Like, I think it has to do a lot with someone's belief in how people learn, right? If you don't have like a strong I think, constructivist bent to how you believe people learn, kids and adults, it is very hard for a teacher to exist in a project-based system because there's just so much, experiential things happening, so much, building of knowledge and constructing, what you're learning. So that's one thing that I have found helpful when I screen and interview teachers. And then also when I onboard them, if they're having a hard time, we do a lot of onboarding training. We send people to a conference where they're able to get like the basics. But we rely pretty heavily on our PLC and adult collaborative structures to onboard teachers as well. Because as much as I like to think all my staff would like me to train them how to be a PBL teacher, even though I've done it, I go train other schools. They don't necessarily, right, like want me to be the one teaching them. So they do a good job. Obviously we have the Center for Excellence, which supports us, but they do a good job supporting one another. And a lot of the adult learning that we do during the year has to do with project development. But I think just understanding too what some of those hangups are for people, like when you have, especially if you're an any type of teacher coming into the new environment, like there is a little bit of control you have to let go of, and just acceptance of some not messy, but just like the process that kids are going to go through to learn looks and feels a little bit different. So if you really like, kind of a more traditional path, it will be very hard for you to be in that environment. And I think sometimes that's what leads to turnover. In our school, that's been what I've observed. We've had some unfortunate turnover because of staffing cuts the last couple of years, but I think we've, through how we interview people, how we onboard people, we've been able to kind of stabilize. We haven't had turnover other than people, unfortunately, being let go from our district.
So a follow-up to that is, let's say we have a new teacher, and sometimes, teachers get placed, things happen, or there's what are some of maybe the baseline aspects in a year one teacher or brand new teacher who is just trying to navigate just being a teacher? Right. And here they are on a campus like ours that's doing projects all over the place, and we talk projects and we talk all this stuff. But what are some of those like core, just like baseline pieces that you would want to focus on or would recommend others to kind of focus on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I try to help new teachers or anyone coming into the environment, just to focus first on like building a really basic context for kids around their learning. Right. And always remembering that, the good instructional practices that exist in any classroom exist in project-based learning. They just exist under the umbrella of a project context. So that's where I recommend people to start. Just like work on building that context for kids so that they have a relevant connection for what they're learning, and make sure that you're using high leverage, research-based instructional strategies to deliver the information. And don't feel overwhelmed. Like, we do have some really advanced practitioners on our campus who do amazing projects out in the community, but they've been delivering projects. They've been doing projects for 10 years. They have a lot of experience. So if you're new, that's like the gold standard, right? You want to work towards that, obviously, but just providing context, providing them with a relevant real world connection, even if it's a sort of that underneath that umbrella are good instructional practices. Like you're not just turning the kids loose, like, oh, here's your driving question. Like, I'll see you in 3 weeks. Good luck with Google. Like that's not good for anybody. The teacher included, definitely not the kids. So just setting the context, using good practices, I think is the best, at least overwhelming way to help people get started.
Okay. So I'm also looking at the time. So I'm also kind of reprioritizing some of these, some more logistical pieces. So we just talked a little bit about supporting teachers, but, our block schedule, typically we're like in a 90-minute block schedule. This year's been different. How would you suggest supporting a more traditional, like if a kid's had a 45-minute class to longer blocks? So two-part question. One, how would you suggest like supporting in a 45-minute block, or a teacher moving from a 45-minute block to a 90-minute block, which a lot of the schools that we're working with now, we're seeing them trying to make that transition?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all about project planning. I mean, I think a lot of structural issues that come up in project-based learning for teachers and schools have to do with the initial project planning, which is something that makes PBL really daunting, I think, for teachers, because it is a ton of work up front. not as much maybe as you're going through your project experience. So I think that helping teachers map out their project, right? We encourage people to start, like, begin with the end in mind, backwards mapping. Here's where we want the kids to be. Here's the steps they're going to need to take to get there. And then if you're shifting your time, it's really just, and I mean, maybe being, as you're learning, even being so detailed as like, okay, well, here's what they're going to do here's what I would have had them do for 45 minutes in a row. So maybe I can combine that, but just being really strategic. And I know that sounds like counter to PBL because it sounds very like regimented, but I think as you're making that shift and kind of learning to navigate that, it can help to just be really concrete in your planning and in your project mapping, so that you can make that transition. Because it is a lot of time. It's either a lot of time to fill, or you have 45 minutes and it doesn't feel like enough time. So just being really intentional with your planning, and then also, reflective and kind of, forgiving yourself if things don't go exactly the way you wanted.
Yeah, I'm glad that question was on our list, because, that is a question we're dealing with and handling with teachers working on that teaching and learning aspect, as they're making that transition, or even in very like, hey, I'm a 50-minute block. How am I supposed to do a project? I'm like, well, here's how you do it, right? You think about, well, what are the questions they need to know? What's the launch? How does it include and connect? The real key is like, what strategy are you going to use, and what strategy are kids using? And then that idea of differentiation is like, are you giving the same thing for every kid, or are they having multiple modalities to kind of explore with that? So there's definitely some really creative ways, but it's peeling back that, growth mindset for not only the learners, but teachers as well. So it's been exciting to see some of those improvements. So how would you incorporate new students? Let's say, the kids in our student panel last week said like, hey, one went to PBL middle school. The other one's like, this is my first experience in PBL. From a leadership lens, if we get a student who is new, let's say they transfer to our school as a junior, how do you do that? What are some things you're thoughtful of to make sure that they have a transition?
Yeah. So, I think that we start by really placing a priority on relationships with all of our kids, right? Between the kids and each other, between the kids and the adults. So that foundation is really firm for us. And it's something that we have place a high value on. So we spend a lot of time, tending to that aspect of our culture. And I think that helps us in onboarding new students, for a couple reasons. One, what I'll do is meet with, often, we're a small school, right? So I do a lot of things maybe principal doesn't traditionally do, but I meet with transfer students. So we have 10 kids transferring in next year who aren't freshmen. And I've Zoomed with them. We've, talked about their schedules, answered their questions. We'll do a little orientation night for them. But when they arrive at school, the teachers know, like, because there aren't tons of new kids coming in, right? Like the teachers know who the new students are, and the other students know who the new students are. And they really do a good job just bringing them in naturally. Like I don't think we have to do, one year we tried to have like a transfer students support group, right, that met at lunch to like help them make friends. And it was okay. I mean, the kids came for a while, right? But then they just sort of naturally made friends. The other students really brought them in, our leadership kids, just the culture of the school, they make sure to go around and kind of introduce themselves. So I think that, having some concrete structures in place to help make sure the kids know logistically what's going on is important, but then also to just really tend to that culture where the kids really do a good job of taking care of each other. And it doesn't take a long time for students who transfer in after ninth grade to really like fold into the culture of the school.
Yeah, it's one of the things students talked about last week was just that idea of building how important the relationships were, right? Like what advice would you give? They're like, build relationships with your kids. And then also that idea of like, one of the questions that came up was, well, how do you give and receive feedback as peers? And like, we want more of it because we trust our peers because we know they're going to be honest with us.
Yeah.
And that doesn't happen overnight. And I think that just goes to show like that idea of like, hey, you build this, this culture. It's more than just getting along, right? It's building that idea of that trust and respect for each other around that.
Absolutely.
Next question. So how are we supporting our English language learners, maybe who are new or struggling with language, but what are the supports that we're looking at in our project designs in supporting English language learners?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that it's similar to the question about the blocks, right? It's all about planning, and similar to instructional strategies, we use the same strategies to support EL learners at our school that you would use in any environment, because they're good strategies and they're good for kids and they work. So we offer, a standalone, like a designated ELD course for our students who are English language learners. The population that we have at our school is growing. So we strategically support them in that way. And then, part of the project planning process is to imagine and think about and build in specific in-class supports for English language learners. And those tend to be, right, those great instructional strategies that are not just good for our English language learners, but are good for all kids. So it's really just continuing, I think, and those are things, if you're transitioning into a PBL environment, your teachers will be familiar with, they'll be comfortable with. So reassuring them that, like, that all comes with you into your project context. You don't have to let go of any of those practices that are really great for kids.
This is another fun one, logistical one. Like, what are some of the school-wide supports we have for struggling students?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a similar thing, but we have a structure that we've called Access, which is like a teacher office hour time, or an RTI, response to intervention time. And we have that available a couple times a week, so students can go and get reteaching from their teacher, whether it's sort of like a voluntary drop-in on their part, or if the teacher's offering something that's a reteaching that's a little bit more structured and the student's invited to participate. And then we just really depend on, like, our data-driven interventions. We have we use MTSS at our school. We have, early indicators that students might be struggling. And we have a support team and resources in place to respond when students reach that level. And then we work with our staff to make sure that they, know all of those, the great, like, tier 1 strategies that they can use to support students as they start to struggle academically in their classes.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing questions come in. So right now I have 2 more on my list. So this is zipping on through. So this is one that we get common, and it's also a really exciting time because of the growth and success we've had around our special education department across last year. So one, if you can share a little bit about, because it's always a question we get, and I know for those of you that are on April 6th, we're going to be doing another one of these with Susan and our special ed person around how we've done these, and very focused on just special ed. But one, if you just quickly share, like, the growth that we've had with our special ed students in comparison, about how great we've been working on with that. And then also, like, what are some of the structures we're doing to achieve that?
Yeah, so we have our special ed population has, I think it's even like tripled, not even doubled, tripled in the last 5 years since I've been at New Tech. So we're sitting at about 11-12% of our students have IEPs. About 30% of those IEPs are for our students on the autism spectrum. And they are doing great. So something that we've implemented a new screen, like a ELA and math screener in our district. And we were very excited to get our initial results back and see that our kids with IEPs are performing in ELA at the same level, almost exactly the same level as our general ed students, which are outperforming many of the other schools in our district. Not, that I'm competitive. I just felt like it was such an amazing data point for the work that our special ed team is doing. And, math, a little bit more of a gap, right? But still, higher than what we see in other schools. And I think, the structure that we use a directed studies model and like a blended directed studies kind of push-in model. So we do have kids who receive their IEP minutes in a class with their resource teacher around, whatever their growth goals are in support. And then we have our team, we have 2 teachers, 2 special ed teachers who work really closely with, I would say, especially like our 9th and 10th graders. We put a pretty strong emphasis on those grades to get kids like a solid foundation. And they do push in to different places as needed. And we use our IAs and support staff in the same way. So it's really a collaborative effort, I would say, between our special ed department and our general ed teachers, as and it helps when the kids, come into directed studies, and we have them grouped by grade level. So it's easier to support, like, oh, we know all the 9th graders are working on this project, 11th graders have this going on. And then the team's really able to navigate and see, like, oh, this is a spot where our kids are having trouble. So we're going to push in there. We're going to join the class. We're going to help support them in that way. So it's pretty, I wouldn't say it's individualized to each kid, but we really try to kind of track some trends in areas where kids tend to need the most help, some of our highest leverage points. And it seems to be working really well. And I think the small environment, which, well, whether you're in a large or small school, right, just having those relationships with the resource teacher and the general ed teachers has really helped our students with IEPs and their families.
Yeah, I know we're all really excited about that. And for those of you that are on April 6th, and I'm hoping I'm getting that date right, we're going to do another panel where we'll get more in depth about some of those supports and how we're doing that at school. So hopefully you can join us on that one as well. So we're down to our last question. So I'm going to kind of reframe it a little bit. This is more focused on like the structures, but for those that are attending and will watch this as well when it goes up on our website, about what recommendation or advice would you give? I mean, you helped start a new PBL school, big comprehensive, you're running one that's been going for 25 years. So you've seen all of it, right? You have such wealth of experience. What advice or recommendations would you give to other leaders around the country and the world who will see this and are watching now around, how to support or their next steps, their teachers and systems, or just anything that you've learned? What would you like to share with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of my biggest learnings is to take reasonable steps in implementing the shift. And I know as a school leader, I get like real like, oh my gosh, I think we can just do everything all at once. But what I've observed is that, and it's a hard balance, I think, as a school leader, especially when you're going through any sort of school transformation, right? Like there's a real need to make a shift. There's a whole lot of urgency around that. You see what the kids need. But, what I've observed is taking on too much tends to, not result in any sort of anything within the implementation being done with quality. So just really being strategic and focused, like each year maybe, or each semester, whatever period of time, your context the best, but just having a really focused goal or professional learning structure for your teachers, and just get really good at doing one thing at a time or two things at a time, or whatever your system can bear and do well. That's what I have found to be the most effective and most helpful for teachers in making such a big shift. I think that in environments where I've observed lots of shifts happening at one time, like none, like maybe 5 or 6 years later, like things balance out. But at first it's just nothing. It's just really hard to do so much well at one time.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that makes it quick and easy, and we're done at the top of the hour. So I'm going to stop the recording.